This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Adviser Show. Your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hello and welcome to the SMSF Adviser Show. I'm your host, Keith Ford, joined as always by my co-host, Aaron Dunn from Smarter SMSF. How are you today, Aaron?
Very well, Keith. Yourself?
Doing very well. It's, good. Back in the rhythm. We both had a small break last week.
You did. You're not wearing your Disney princess dress, though. Keith went on the Disney cruise out of Sydney. So, he didn't send me any of the photos with his Disney princess costume on, and he's not wearing it today. So no. I'm a little bit disappointed.
Only my daughter in the Disney princess outfits, getting photos with Rapunzel and the like. But myself, I stayed off to the side, let her get all of that. I should have brought some Mickey ears in though.
Yes.
So we have quite a few things to talk about today, none of which revolve around me being dressed in Disney princess gear. The first topic that we're going to get to is a bit of a backflip, would we call it? It wasn't a full reversion, so maybe not a backflip, maybe a half tuck. I don't know enough about
side
gymnastics.
Spin, whatever.
Yeah, one of those. I really should have brushed up on the gymnastics terms. But the government essentially changing its stance on the stage 3 tax cuts, which it said was to make room for middle Australia. Long story short, everyone who was meant to get tax cuts will still be better off than they would if there were no tax cuts, but the higher end less better off than they would have been. So those earning less than $150,000 will benefit from the tax cuts a lot more. They're originally supposed to get rid of the 37% tax bracket that would be applied to income between 120 and 180 and reduce the 32.5% tax rate to 30% for all income between 45,000 and 200,000. Some of those rules have changed. The idea basically being that people that were earning 200,000 or more will now save, I think it's $4,529 on their tax instead of $9,075. So a substantial difference there of about $4,500. But the benefit to people in those lower brackets is going to be greater. So, Aaron, I guess just what are your thoughts on these tax cut changes?
Yeah, well, so clearly what they've done is they've looked at the redistribution of the tax concession or the fact that the bracket creep adjustment that was meant to occur, they've in essence redistributed that, like you said, to middle Australia. And yes, everyone in essence will get the change, but some that were expected to get much higher, those in the higher tax bracket, are clearly now not going to get, and they're getting about half in essence is what they were.
Basically half, yeah.
So the reality is that, we have been talking about contribution opportunities and those sort of things for individuals that were maybe going to have a greater level of surplus. They might not have that same level of surplus, but in reality, those opportunities exist. I guess there's an element to it where the government says, well, we want to redistribute this and that's much better. Quite clearly, there'll be some that will have bracket creep, I should say, come much earlier than what was forecast under the or what is currently legislation. I think that's the most important thing because phase 3 tax cuts are legislated. So it requires the Labor government to have to pass a bill to enable that change to become law. So that's why they will need to work with the Greens. They're obviously trying to put pressure on Peter Dutton around what the coalition's response is going to be, and he's quite clearly not declaring his hand at the moment. So therefore, there is still a fair bit to play out in this. And equally, the other side of this coin is that we have now a government that has broken trust. So they were very resolute for the best part of a year or more insofar that stage 3 will go through unchanged. Now, their arguments here all sound legitimate and warranted given the cost of living pressures and so forth. But anything that comes out of their mouth now, and I note even this morning I was listening to the topic of negative gearing, and they would say, and this would naturally impact our RBAs and that sort of stuff in SMSF, giving it some context here, but we're not going to make any changes to negative gearing, now sounds like, well, yes, it is going to, because you can't be trusted with the change. And this is the challenge that they now have as a government, and the opposition, I think, will ride these sort of things home for a long period of time, because us as taxpayers, we need to now question, if they're not going to make a change, well, does that mean that they're not, or does that just mean that they're saying it for the sake of saying it and that they probably will in the future? And that's the balance that you have in government in trying to build trust. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, being elected, did talk about that very issue, trying to rebuild trust in politics and so forth. And yet here we are back at sort of Groundhog Day looking at these sort of issues. So there's an element of saying, well, yeah, look, the when you look at that redistribution, it makes sense, but it's the politics in here that are going to be quite interesting as we move into 2024.
The cynical view, of course, is why was anyone trusting anything that came out of a politician's mouth to begin with? That is the cynical take on it. But it is one of those things where sometimes governments do what they think is the best and make popular changes that are against, well, that's right. Whether it's because it's populist or because it's the best for the country, you can, decide on your own. But, they do that. And then there's the fallout of, well, yeah, but now you've broken your word. And how do we trust anything after that? And it's a flow-on effect that, because every single government that's ever run a country has broken a promise.
Yeah, correct.
It's not unique, but the first time for a new government has a bigger impact, especially when it's something that's already legislated, I guess. But yeah, it is one of those things where everyone will still be better off than they would have been had the stage 3 tax cuts not ever been in place. Still $4,500 for people that are on about $200,000. It's not nothing, but certainly if you had been planning around that, it's certainly going to be a bit of a shock.
Yeah. And again, I think bringing this back to SMSFs for a second, if you've got individuals that are, and then we take people in retirement phase, for example, we know that the minimum pension obligations have gone up and some people need to take more than what they might be spending. I mean, these redistribution of tax cuts might actually be quite good for those older pensioners and so forth that might be building up asset bases outside of superannuation. And the fact that, the lower rate goes from 19% to 16%. So all of these things, it actually makes some of the conversation a bit more interesting about, well, do you keep paying money out or do you look to retain some money in superannuation? Those sort of conversations which do happen with your SMSF clients and more broadly superannuation clients is something, again, that advisors will need to go back and have conversations with their clients about. So yeah, it does open up an opportunity to have conversations with the clients about what and how it impacts them in terms of contribution strategies and so forth, as we've touched on. But I think equally there'll be some discussions that'll be had with those that are drawing income streams as well.
Yeah, and one of the other things was that the government said that it wasn't going to hurt inflation, basically, as well, which anytime I have to assume that the way they're calculating it is based on whether the stage 3 tax cuts went through in full and going through the way that they are now, that they're broadly revenue neutral, I believe is the term that was used, and won't add to inflationary pressures. But if anyone was arguing that the stage 3 tax cuts were going to cause inflation, it probably wasn't going to be against each other. It's going to be if you got rid of them completely. So I don't know whether that's necessarily been addressed and whether it will have an impact. Certainly, you would assume that higher level earners have more disposable income, which would then they're spending less on necessities. And so it would then, I guess, more inflationary pressure. But, based on the modeling that the government cited, it was that it wouldn't affect inflation, basically.
Yeah, I find it's quite an interesting conversation because you kind of say, well, you get these redistribution of the tax concessions, and for those that need it, the money's going straight back to the energy companies and the, wherever else, people have got shortfalls in their cost of living. So, so that's the way of the world, the way the money spins. And to what extent that sort of stuff has on inflation and so forth, well, I'll leave those to the economists who know it much better than I do.
That's it. You could argue, discretionary spending being higher for the higher incomes, but maybe they would have saved more of the tax cuts. And so then it wouldn't have had the same impact on inflation, and giving it to lower income earners will actually increase inflation because they are more likely to need to spend it. But, again, as you said, not an economist. So I'm not going to break any definitive statements there. That's for sure.
Yes.
Another subject that we wanted to talk about this week was also surrounding the budget. We've been seeing a lot of pre-budget submissions come out, a lot of industry bodies, of course. And for the purposes of the SMSF sector, the SMSF Association has delivered their pre-budget submission. They covered a lot of ground, everything from, tax deductibility of advice within super, equity in the system. What were your thoughts on some of the things that the SMSF Association talked about, Aaron?
Yeah, so to me, it was made for quite interesting reading, because when you read through it, you do get a sense of, there's a bit of us against them in it. And what I mean by that is that they referred to the fact that we need appropriate and considered balance of needs and diverse ranges of sector participants, open and timely engagement of proposed amendments and measures. This is the sort of stuff, when we saw the Division 296 consultation, there's 2 weeks to try and consult on new pieces of legislation. We see the NALI and NALI rules, where for 5 or more years there's been aggregated consultation of different industries together, APRA funds, SMSFs, and then we get a carved out position on self-managed super funds, and APRA funds can basically wipe their hands of it. So some of those, I think, were quite pointed in the terminology that was made in that. And equally, I think they're just flagging the importance of making sure things that have been floating around for some time actually get the right attention that they deserve to. If we think here about the getting a licensing regime that is fit for purpose for appropriately qualified accountants, noting that the limited licensing model is a dying model. I'd say if it's not on life support, that would be an understatement. So trying to find these things when they were flagged initially in the quality of advice review, but they've then been overlooked in its entirety. I think you raised the point there, Keith, as well, about deductibility of fees. And I think there was a pointed comment as well inside the submission too. There was. So when talking about the divide between members of APRA funds and members of SMSFs, when it comes to the tax deductibility of advice and the ability for advice fees to be taken from super funds, they did mention that when we compare the pair, and then went on to talk about the way that the financial advice can be used within the two kind of different funds, which obviously are fairly, pointing to industry fund advertising, all of that kind of stuff. So certainly pointing out the differences with a clever little turn of phrase there, which I quite enjoyed. Yes, correct.
I have to imagine, I don't know who specifically wrote the submission. I'm sure it was a few people in there, but they were probably pretty pleased with the with getting that in there, I have to think.
Yes. Yeah, I think that'd be a fair comment. So yeah, and we do see in submissions in a lot of the other, I guess, outstanding issues that they would like to see, and they may have spoken about and pushed previously. So in the SMSF sector, we still have, unresolved matters such as the amnesty around complying pensions and changes to the residency requirements. And then equally issues like where there is an absolute lack of clarity around the way in which target market determinations work and so forth, and therefore trying to put forward some solutions or some considerations that may form part of consultation, may not. And, basically it's the opportunity for the associations and others at this point of time to kind of throw stuff in the pot Some stuff just gets basically tossed out straight away, and other things might form part of the discussion. And this time of year, we do generally start to get a sense of what the government's thinking about, because you do start to see a little bit of fishing. So stuff gets rolled out, tested a bit, and then sort of pull the line back in and see what you can catch. And then that sort of stuff starts to make up what might form as part of the budget in May each year.
Always hoping that what people put forward ends up getting grabbed in some way in the trawling net, I suppose. But we did also something that you thought played in quite well with the tax cut changes. We had a piece on SMSF Adviser that was using some of the comments from Liam Short from Sonus Wealth, who was talking about the need for liquidity planning to already be in place for the $3 million super tax, Div 296. And I guess your idea there is that planning too far ahead when things can change can be a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, Liam's 100% right. I mean, the reality is we need to start to understand the implications of what is going on with our clients and those that are impacted by it, and what their position might look like inside and outside of super. But the tax cut changes that are being proposed by the government is a perfect case in point of we can't shoot the gun too early and see a situation whereby our clients start to make these changes, and then all of a sudden what transpires in the negotiation, because what I should say again, just to reiterate, is we do have the Division 296 rules referred to a Senate committee, and that Senate committee is to report back in April. So we have some time here that will transpire that we might see changes. We might see negotiation. We might see, therefore, some of the concerns that are being raised around indexation or the unrealized capital gains, some adjustment to that. And that will dramatically change the landscape as to whether we might move assets out or we might not. So it's not an ideal situation. We're talking about clients with much larger values, with much larger and potentially lumpier assets. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that things could change and change very quickly. And I use those stage 3 tax cuts as the perfect example of don't go too early, because you won't have the opportunity to recover the changes that you may have actually done.
Yeah, and I doubt anyone who had been planning with those stage 3 tax cuts that were legislated and had been told by the government weren't changing, anyone planning for these changes coming in, they probably were feeling pretty confident, 6 months out from them coming into place.
Yep, 100%. So I just think you need to be raising these issues with the clients, talking to them about it, considering what the alternatives look like, but I wouldn't necessarily be executing on the back of something that is not yet legislated. And we don't even have regulations. We have a bill. We don't have the regulations that sit behind it as well. Hence why I think we will see a little bit more water to go under the bridge as part of this Senate inquiry too.
Absolutely. No harm in having a plan in place for even when it does come in.
Absolutely.
All right, we're going to take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll be joined by Shelley Banton, who's the head of education at ASF Audits. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, we're joined now by Shelley Banton, who's the head of education at ASF Audits. Welcome to the show, Shelley.
Thank you, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great having you on the show. You're joining us today. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics within the auditing space. The first thing that we were going to jump into was surrounding the Melissa Caddick case, which has, of course, resulted in a class action being raised against, I believe, 11 different auditors within the SMSF space. It has highlighted a lot of potential risks for SMSF auditors. What are your thoughts on the Melissa Caddick case and the overall implications for the audit industry, and whether it's a black mark or if it's not necessarily indicative of the entire profession?
Look, it's a really good question, and it's one that's come up in the media last year. And there was actually an article that was written in a publication that really said that the entire SMSF audit profession's been, besmirched. And I sort of disagreed with that. I really think that, 5 auditors don't make up the whole pot. Certainly, auditors take a great pride in what they do, and we're here to make sure that, the rules are obviously adhered to each and every time we do the audit. All we want at the end of the day is for our trustee clients to be compliant, to be perfectly honest. And so when we see things that go, belly up and awry and all this sort of thing, it is a little bit concerning, because we want to make sure that they're on that road to compliance. So whatever we can do to help them to get back there is what we need to do and what we do. In this particular case, there was several auditors who really just looked at the evidence on face value, and we don't know. I mean, we are speculating on this particular case, and we need to be very careful too in terms of, tarnishing these auditors with a brush that they may or may not have deservedly been, taken on. So all we really can do, and what I did with an article that I wrote last year, is that I looked at the evidence that was submitted to the court in the original ASIC versus Melissa Caddick case. And in there was actually a ComSec account that was obviously fraudulently prepared. There was a portfolio statement in there, and it had investments in there that didn't exist. Now, we don't know. We can only assume that this evidence is the same type of evidence that is, available, or what is going to be shown up in the auditor cases as well. But we don't know. So on these particular statements, basically they're broker statements. They're not custodially held. So when you get a broker statement, you have to go and query those broker statements by looking at the HIN or the SRN number. You have to get the postcode, and you have to go and search the share registry websites for not all the shares, for obviously a selection of shares that, falls under your criteria, and you have to confirm the existence of those assets. So in this particular case, obviously, and unfortunately, those investments just really went to town. They didn't exist because those checks and balances weren't done. And I don't think that sort of work is indicative of the entire SMSF audit industry. If it was, we would be seeing a lot more auditor cases coming out than what we already had. There's 2 known ones, the Baumgartner one and the McGoldrick ones, and that was several years ago. That was 5 years ago now. So we haven't actually seen any auditor cases come to light until now. The auditor cases that we have seen come to light have been those that have happened, several years back as well. So if we look at the Caddick stuff, it is 2014, 2015. So it does take a lot of time for this litigation and for this, perfect storm in terms of working out who's responsible, who needs to get the checks and balances, who needs to be in the firing line at the end of the day. And unfortunately, it always seems to be the auditor. And, we're the last person standing with the PI insurance, which is obviously, slim pickings for some litigators who really want to make sure that their trustee clients, and understandably so, are losses in that fund, those funds, not that they're not continuing, and that they can come back and they can recoup whatever they can at the end of the day. So, there is a risk with doing SMSF audits. And the risk is, how long do you want to keep your hand on the stove? As an auditor, you make that decision every single day you're doing an audit. And if you want to keep your hand longer on the stove and you don't want to do the work that's, set down by the auditing standards, by the ATO, by a GS 009, by your requirements as a SMSF auditor registered under ASIC, well, then there's going to be a lot more risk that you're going to have to take at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think, Shelley, you hit the nail on the head there before in terms of the fact that the reality is there is a level of risk within the audit profession. We see, we're talking about SMSF specifically here, but we see cases in much greater forms across the audit fraternity more generally. But the reality is, and again, you made the comment of it's, they're lined up last. So it is that opportunity to go, well, there's PI there. The litigator will then look to say, well, were there any obligations imposed on that auditor that maybe should have found that, and therefore it provides an opportunity to try and sort of have some level of recourse if they possibly can. I guess, as you've rightly also stated there, what I find interesting over the journey, and I agree entirely with what you have been saying, is that we have ended up in a situation whereby these cases don't actually happen that often. But what we do see more and more now is the work that gets done within the industry to ensure that the standards of audits are much higher than ever before. So the fact that we have a registration process, the fact that we have a referral process and an audit, the auditor program, these are all things that obviously have lifted standards over a period of time.
And that's right. And that's one of the reasons why the independence requirements were changed under APS 110 a few years back, simply because of getting those standards up higher is what we needed to do to make sure that there's integrity in the system at the end of the day. And, you know, you've got to look at who the duty of care, who that rests with. So is the duty of care in terms of the accounting function, is that something that's obviously, you know, not up to scratch? Is that something that lawyers can go and litigate against? Possibly not. There is an obvious duty of care in terms of what SMSF auditors need to do under their terms of engagement. And what is that duty of care? Has that been broken? And is there, you know, the liability that's held responsible from the SMSF auditor's point of view? And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to a legal technicality at the end of the day. So it does become interesting from a litigation point of view, and it helps us understand essentially, I guess, why SMSF auditors are in the firing line.
Mm. So let's maybe move on and think about some of the challenges ahead, and I guess the way in which we look at our financial and compliance audit. Quite obviously, we've got things like Division 296, which, as Keith knows, was my favourite word throughout the SMSF Adviser shows last year. Well, only in the second half of the year, because we didn't actually know that term, Keith, until a later point in time.
It did, and it took a little getting used to, but I think we should set up like a swear jar almost for every time you mention Div 296, like put $1 in the jar.
Yeah.
Is that because you're swearing, Keith?
It brings a reaction from me, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But Shelley, I mean, these things are going to become, I'm going to use the word interesting, I guess, from the audit context, and maybe, you know, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, and I guess getting some insights into what some of these challenges might present for the audit fraternity.
I think that there'll be an increased focus, obviously, on market valuation. Having said that, like, we have had an increased focus on market valuation for several years now.
Yep.
And it relates primarily to those more complex assets like property and unlisted entities. So they're going to be the difficult ones moving forward as we get closer to the introduction of Div 296. So we're going to, I guess, continue to seek that evidence that we need to make sure that, you know, we can comply with the auditing standards. And as the ATO has put on their website, you know, we need to have that objective and supportable data in our audit file. So unless the trustees do their job properly, as I've always said, we can't do our job properly. It's not our job to, you know, value the assets within a fund. We don't know, you know, what the markets are. There's very different nuances in different assets and all of that sort of stuff. And it really isn't our job to actually take a leap of faith and make sure that, you know, the market value is correct, notwithstanding that we have no evidence on file. So there is going to be a lot more pushback from SMSF auditors on this particular issue, because we're not going to take the risk. We just can't afford to. It's not something that, you know, we need to have, you know, and continue to think about on a daily basis. We just need to do our job properly. And unfortunately, making sure that we have that evidence on file, it'll be up to the trustees to make sure that they provide us with that. And if they can't provide us with that, and they're not thinking about those sorts of responsibilities and obligations they need to undertake at the time they're purchasing that asset, well, they need to have more education from their financial planner, from their accountant, even their potential auditor, to provide them with, you know, an overview of how difficult it's going to be for them at audit.
So does this become like conversations that, rather than waiting until we get to what would be 30 June 2026 financials, I mean, having conversations with auditors prior to that, given the relations that we have with our audit fraternity generally, I mean, getting some level of understanding of this is going to be more advantageous to be discussing it earlier rather than trying to fight and have the arguments about it when you're going through the audit process. Well, that'd be a fair comment, wouldn't it?
Look, that would be, and it's about working with that entire SMSF team. So wherever, there needs to be support provided in terms of educational training or whatever that needs to be to get that message across to trustees who are the ones who are purchasing those assets. Now, obviously that a lot, vet those decisions through their SMSF professional team, which is fabulous, because once the horse is bolted, you can't actually just grab it and put it back in the stable as easily as you want to. And sometimes, as you know, Aaron, there's no comeback from, say, having an in-house asset that you can't do anything with apart from dispose of by the end of the next income year. So if it's over that 5% mark. Yep. So it's interesting because the SIS rules don't work line by line. They work holistically and they work together. And sometimes when, trustees are trying to get themselves out of a bind, they actually just get themselves into different sort of issues elsewhere that compliance bobs up because they haven't thought about how that works, holistically. So it does make it sort of more difficult. And, we just want our clients to be compliant, as I keep saying, at the end of the year.
Yep, absolutely. So what are some of the other, I guess, problems or maybe more to the point, the emerging issues that you're seeing that are creating problems for auditors in the last financial year and I guess as we move into 2024?
Well, I think that the perennial one is documentation. And, we see it with new clients coming on board that we don't get the takeover docs that need to be provided to us at audit. We don't get the trust deeds. We don't get the investment strategies, last year's reports, the financials, the portfolio statements, no asset searches. So it's these sorts of little things at the smallest end, and it's not like small stuff, but what I'm talking about is that things that you would naturally expect to come through doesn't, which makes it difficult and holds up the audit at the end of the day too. Then you've got things like during the audit. So are you getting the rental statements? Is there a lease agreement? Is that in place? Is it to a related party? Even smaller things like getting the HIN number and postcode. So it's all the little devils in the detail nuances of, documentation that we can't get our hands on, that it stops us, undertaking the audit in a seamless fashion, which is really what we want. We're all about having that audit as the one-click process. So get into your software, press the button, send the audit to us. We will then look at the information online and assuming it's all there, it should just run seamlessly through and be easily done. And there shouldn't be a lot of interruptions. But the lack of documentation really is one of the biggest issues that we have in audit. And then you've got those other issues, obviously, the known issues that relate to different complex assets. So if you've got the unlisted entities, we go back to market valuation. What documentation are you providing for that market value? Is it a shared trading that's happened through the year? Is it a independent report from the CEO or the CFO of that company? And if it is, does that report then, or that valuation, does that actually include a methodology of how they've arrived at that if there is no share trading? So it's all of these sorts of things which are all on the ATO website. They have a fairly comprehensive guidelines as to market valuation. If you generally follow those and you provide us with all that information at audit, it generally follows that you're going to have very few or no audit queries, which is going to hold up your audit. And as we're getting closer to the 15th of May, the run rate is getting bigger if those delays just continue.
Yeah, so and you can forget the 15th of May. We're looking at the 28th of Feb first. So I reckon the friction points are going to be coming up very fast over the next 4 or so weeks. So
100%.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Shelley. A lot in there, and we'll hopefully avoid any documents to auditors that are fraudulent ComSec accounts.
That'd be awesome. Yes. Thanks a lot, Keith.
All right, we'll take a quick break now and come back in a moment. All right, we're back again, joined by Aaron Dunn. To wrap up what we've been talking about today, from our discussion that we just had with Shelley, what were the most important or most interesting topics that jumped out to you?
Yeah, well, I think naturally the Melissa Caddick case has had a lot of interest and still, I guess, has a lot of interest generally, but more specifically to the SMSF industry. And I think I touched on it in the conversation with Shelley, in that the fact that we will see a number of these sort of cases come along on occasion whereby there is some sort of loss that's occurred and therefore there is an obvious opportunity to target the auditor to see whether, as part of their audit process in conducting the compliance and financial audit, whether their opinion that was formed can stack up in essence in a court of law. And whilst the industry has moved along and progressed significantly from the registration process through to the way in which the ATO has oversight along with ASIC, we're still going to see these things. And the more that we see fraud and those sort of scams and so forth happen, we are going to continue to see auditors that's in the future in the gun as well. So, yeah, that's a story that has started that we no doubt will hear a little bit more about as we move through 2024 too. Yeah,
obviously, the class action it's begun. It hasn't certainly been wrapped up. It hasn't been finalized. It's one of those things where when you only kind of get the side from the law firm that's lodging a class action, you see what they've said and you think, wow, that seems ridiculous. How could these completely fraudulent documents not be flagged? And the funds being given a clean bill of health, I think was one of the phrases used. And so, when you look at it like that, it seems really obvious. And I guess throughout the class action, we'll find out a bit more about whether it was as clear cut or whether it was a bit more murky than we perhaps are being told by the law firm at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, as is always the way, if anyone has any suggestions on topics and speakers and the like, Keith, how can they get in contact with us?
That's right, smsfadvisoronline.com.au for any of those suggestions.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again for joining us for this week's edition of the SMSF Adviser Show. See you in a fortnight's time. Take care and bye for now.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.